Okay, let's dive straight into this. Welcome to today's explainer. We're going to unpack one of the most fascinating and honestly rarely talked about psychological tightropes that any professional walks today. We're looking at this massive, kind of hidden gap between academic theology and Sunday preaching. I mean, imagine this. You spend years in rigorous university study, right? You're dissecting ancient texts, learning original languages, figuring out the complex history behind how religious scriptures were actually formed. But then, you have to stand in front of hundreds of hopeful people every single weekend and talk about those exact same texts in a completely different way.
So this brings up a really compelling question. How do modern, highly educated pastors preach stories that their own academic training tells them, well, probably didn't happen as actual historical events? Put yourself in their shoes for just a second. You're a modern clergy member facing this ultimate moral collision. On one side, you've got the historical facts you've studied and accepted. But on the other side, you've got the deeply held expectations of your congregation, and they're looking to you for literal truth, for guidance, for absolute certainty. So how do you bridge that gap without completely losing your mind, or, your job? Well, the crucial point here revolves around a concept you might have heard of, cognitive dissonance. This is basically the core psychological antagonist of our explainer today. It's that deeply uncomfortable, totally mind-bending mental state where a person holds two contradictory beliefs at the exact same time. Or it's when someone's core understanding of reality clashes directly with the actions they literally have to take. And for an educated clergy member, this isn't just some abstract academic theory. No, it is a profound, daily occupational hazard. To really feel this intense psychological strain, just picture this contrast. Think about Friday night in the pastor's study. They're sitting there reading academic papers, maybe reviewing how certain biblical events are widely considered by scholars to be, say, theological literary fiction rather than actual documented history, right? Then, fast forward to Sunday morning at the pulpit. That exact same person is expected to preach those events, things like walking on water or physical resurrections, to a trusting, faithful congregation. Sociologists have actually studied this, and they've found that human beings simply cannot sustain that level of mental friction without adapting. Researchers have pinpointed 4 escalating ways that clergy cope with this immense dilemma. Let's look at number 1. This is the first, most common, and honestly, the psychologically safest coping strategy: allegorization. Now, what's really interesting here is the internal justification going on. To resolve that intense cognitive dissonance, they actually undergo a fundamental shift in how they view language itself. The educated cleric looks at the text and asks, you know what, does it even matter if it's a historical fact? They stop reading the Bible as a strict history textbook. Instead, they elevate it. They start reading and preaching it as profound existential poetry. The truth of the text isn't tied to archaeological evidence anymore. It's found in its deep meaning, its moral weight, and its power to change human behavior. Here's how this actually plays out in real life. On one hand, you have literal history, the belief that, say, the Good Samaritan was a real specific guy walking down a specific road, or that the virgin birth was a literal biological event. But on the other hand, you have existential poetry. Through this coping mechanism, the pastor views the Good Samaritan as a brilliant fabricated parable that carries this massive moral truth about universal kindness. The virgin birth, it becomes this powerful symbolic myth representing the absolute purity of a new beginning. Now, it's super important to understand that these pastors do not believe they're maliciously lying to their congregations. Not at all. They're utilizing the text as a metaphor. But here is the catch. They rarely, if ever, explicitly explain this metaphorical shift to the people sitting in the pews. They're speaking the exact same words, but they mean something entirely different.
And that naturally brings us to the second coping mechanism. If the first one was about redefining the text, this next step is all about managing the congregation. Let's talk about paternalism.
Picture an 80-year-old widow sitting right there in the front pew. Her husband of 60 years has just passed away. She's grieving, she's incredibly vulnerable, and she's looking directly to our pastor for hope. Now, from the pastor's perspective, this woman absolutely does not need a harsh, historical, critical breakdown of ancient text right now. She doesn't need to hear about the academic consensus that the Gospel of Mark, in its earliest original manuscripts, actually didn't even have a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. What she needs in that agonizing moment of grief is the comfort of an afterlife. She needs to hear that she's going to see her husband again.
So the pastor engages in what philosophers call the noble lie. They morally justify keeping quiet about the academic stuff. They end up acting almost like protective parents, consciously choosing a merciful untruth, or, at least a merciful omission, over what they see as a cruel reality. They do this to preserve the community's faith, to maintain a sense of comfort, and really, to protect the psychological well-being of everyday people. They're terrified that unleashing raw academic truth would just crush the faith of their flock. It is an incredibly heavy burden, carrying that tension between strict academic integrity and deep, empathetic pastoral care.
But let's move on and see how this builds, because when allegorizing the text or protecting the flock just isn't enough to calm that internal storm, we arrive at the third method. Number 3, the mental split. Think of an actor playing Hamlet on stage. When that actor steps out under the bright lights, they deliver those lines with immense passion, right? Tears in their eyes, completely inhabiting the role. But the actor obviously knows they aren't actually a Danish prince. They are performing. Well, similarly, some priests and pastors begin to view their Sunday duties as a highly professional, deeply ingrained cultural routine. It essentially becomes a performance of tradition that just plays out every single Sunday. Notice the absolute, complete psychological compartmentalization happening here. In the study, you have the rational intellectual. This is the person who knows the historical critical method inside and out. They know exactly how certain letters attributed to the Apostle Paul were, historically speaking, forged by later writers. But then, they walk out into the sanctuary. They put on the robes, they step up to the altar, and they recite these ancient, sacred rituals with total, absolute outward conviction. To survive this, these two worlds, the study and the altar, must never, ever meet in the priest's head. It's a strict firewall, because if that firewall breaks, the mental split collapses. This mechanism is literally designed to prevent a total mental breakdown.
But what happens when that firewall actually does break? Well, we arrive at the fourth and final stage, complete burnout. When the mental split fails, a person simply can't psychologically withstand the dissonance anymore. They just lose their faith entirely. And this isn't just some rare, isolated event. It's actually a massive phenomenon in the West today. So much so that there is a huge, secret, completely anonymous support network out there called the Clergy Project. This is a secure community explicitly for active bishops, priests, and pastors who have realized, through all their studies and experiences, that they just no longer believe in the supernatural elements of their religion, or they've concluded the texts are entirely human creations. Yet, they are still actively leading congregations. Why? Because they literally cannot leave.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real-world anchors that turn a psychological crisis into an absolute trap. We're talking about professionals in their 40s, 50s, or 60s. They've got mortgages to pay, families to support. They've spent decades building a highly specific skill set, preaching, pastoral care, or theology. That, let's be honest, doesn't exactly translate easily to the secular corporate world. If they step up to the microphone on Sunday and declare their true beliefs, the fallout is instantaneous. They lose their job immediately, they lose their entire social circle and community overnight, and in a lot of denominations, they actually live in a parsonage, which is church-owned housing, meaning they'd face immediate homelessness. So, they stay. They preach a God they no longer believe in every single Sunday, living in this agonizing state of constant, incredibly stressful concealment.
So, zooming out for a second to look at the big picture, we can really see the immense daily stress of this internal conflict. This is the ultimate moral dilemma of the modern, educated cleric. It's the profound, crushing weight of holding historically constructed, deeply human texts in your hands while standing week after week in front of earnest, hopeful people who genuinely believe those exact texts were dictated directly by God. It is a wild psychological journey that stretches all the way from gentle reinterpretation to the heavy, deeply isolating burden of living a double life. It really leaves us with a whole lot to think about regarding human psychology, the very nature of belief, and the unseen burdens that professionals carry around with them. When historical reality collides directly with our profound human need for comfort and certainty, who carries the burden of the truth? Is it the academic, the pastor, or the congregation? Thank you so much for exploring this complex psychological landscape with me today. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and I will catch you in the next explainer.